In all seriousness, we're very happy to have an in-person Shaftesbury Society again. It's been a very long time. We're very happy to have you back. My name's Donald Bryson. I'm president of the John Locke Foundation. A lot has changed since the last time we had in-person Shaftesbury, and we'll continue to do these live in-person every 2 weeks. I think the rain has sort of diminished people's want to come out today, especially when this is also being streamed live online. You can just click rather than go and get wet. But for those of you that braved it, thank you so much. And I'm sure the crowds will continue to build as we go over time. To just go back over the history of why we call this Shaftesbury Society, we are the John Locke Foundation, and for the original Constitution of the Colony of Carolina, John Locke was the author of that, but his benefactor was the Earl of Shaftesbury, and so in the honor of that man, the Earl of Shaftesbury, the barony, or Baron Ashley the first, I believe, we have Shaftesbury Society every Monday, and this is sort of the important topics that are going on in North Carolina or in American politics or North Carolina politics. Today we'll hear about what's going on with budget and tax policy in North Carolina. But I wanted to be the first to welcome you back as president of the John Locke Foundation of the new Locke after we've merged with the Civitas Institute. And we're just so happy to have warm bodies in the room again. It's very awkward to do these when it's just you in an empty room and a Zoom call. And so it's much better to have a live audience. But I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brooke Medina. She's our Vice President of Communications. She's going to introduce our speaker today. Thank you. There you go.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Like Donald said, we are very glad that you all have joined us, and we look forward to continuing these in person every other week. And so thank you guys for being a part of this first one as we're getting back into the in-person groove. So I am here to introduce Paige Terryberry, who will be giving you the presentation today. And I hope you guys enjoy the swag bags that you have at your seats, as well as some cake with us afterwards and refreshment, as well as any of the other items that are on those tables in the back. So thank you guys for joining. So Paige Terryberry is the Senior Analyst of Fiscal Policy with the John Locke Foundation. She works with the research team to distill and assess policies key to North Carolina's fiscal outcome. Prior to joining Locke, Paige worked in political consulting at Barron Public Affairs and held positions at the White House Council of Economic Advisors, in addition to interning at several conservative think tanks. Paige received an MA in Applied Economics from George Washington University and a BA in Mathematics from Covenant College. In her free time, Paige enjoys exploring new restaurants and hiking trails or roaming out on the water, often near her hometown in coastal North Carolina. So I'm sure she would be glad to talk with you guys about some of those hiking trail recommendations as well as restaurant ones after her presentation. So with that, I will give you all Paige Terryberry. Can you hear me okay back there? Is it on? Great. All right, well, thanks so much for spending your this rainy Monday afternoon with us. We're excited to be back here in person, as Brooke and Donald shared with you. So I write and research fiscal issues for the state, as well as some national issues as they affect the state. I also write on and contribute to reports such as this one, which is the basis for this presentation. So if you didn't grab one on your way in, they're on the table outside. This is updated every 2 years. So we're excited to announce this one. I'm going to start with our tax legacy history, which is a really positive note to start on, where we used to be, where we are now, and then move to our state budget, where the money comes from, how we spend it, how it's grown, and then close with state debt and unfunded liabilities. So we're starting on a high note, and then we'll end with giving you something to think about. And I realize I'm not plugged into my presentation, so let me do that real quick. Awesome. Okay. All right, so to begin with our tax history. So this is really exciting because North Carolina has an incredible tax history, unlike any other state. We are a leader in tax reform, and we're also proof that tax reform works. We have a decade now of making moves in the right direction, and our state has really transformed over the past decade, thanks to
fiscal conservative leadership. So we'll dive into all of that, beginning with our tax history. But it wasn't as if legislators woke up one day and said, we're going to be fiscally conservative. It actually takes restrained spending to enable tax reform. In restrained spending to balance budgets as opposed to raising taxes, right? That is how we actually get the growth that we want to see as a state. As Milton Friedman said, government spending is the real tax. It's really hard to rein in spending once we continue to spend. So it's much easier to enforce these types of good policies once we have fiscal restraint under control, and really hard to do anything if it's not under control. So what is the goal here? We have to have a goal because in the same way that you can't really teach a toddler, or you don't have to teach a toddler, excuse me, how to be selfish, you don't have to teach the government how to spend your money. So we have to set a goal here, an upper bound, and something that conservatives like to speak on is tying growth and appropriations to not exceed population growth and inflation. This is a good kind of barometer. It's something that we've advocated for at law called the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. So that is our goal here, because why budgets are not, as some might have you believe, political wish lists or ways to get reelected. They should be priorities that respect taxpayer values and taxpayer dollars. So setting the threshold on the taxpayer's ability to fund the budget is really important. So having that upper limit is really, really needed so that the government can be a better steward of taxpayer money. So since the 1990s, Republicans have actually been reducing taxes on everyone, and while Democrats have actually repeatedly increased taxes on everyone, including the sales rate. There is a myth that we are in grave danger of starving our budget. You can find this in any kind of news clippings. I've seen them in recent days and weeks. You know, our budget is starving. This program will surely die out if we don't have more money to throw at this problem. But even with fiscal restraint exhibited by conservative legislators, we've actually grown a lot of areas. Public education, big one for North Carolina, has received a lot of the additional funds. So is Medicaid, as well as putting money away for a rainy day. So since 2011, total compensation for teachers, just to put some data to this, has actually increased 27%. Since 2011, and that's when we started to restrain our spending, so to speak. That's total compensation, not just salaries. And then Medicaid has also expanded, payments to Medicaid, and then our savings reserve. So that's savings reserve is the same thing as the rainy day fund, which you'll hear me talk about later. In 2009-2010 budget, this was at a low point of $150 million. By 2018, thanks to this spending restraint, it went up to $2 billion, and the latest budget set aside over $3 billion to the savings reserve over the biennium, so it will be over $4 billion by 2023, which is a really, really big deal. So talking about where we were before this, how bad were things? So here's just some highlights. So before the 2013 tax reform, we had a Depression-era tax code. It was not only very high tax rates, but it was also very complicated. The tax structure had multiple brackets, 6% to 7.75%, and the 6% was taxed at an actually very low income level. The standard deduction also was extremely low, $3,000 for single filers and $6,000 for head of household. And this, of course, benefits low-income families most, or in this case, doesn't benefit them very much. And so it was very low, and we've made significant progress since then, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But on the business side, we had very high business taxes. The only states worse than us in the Tax Foundation Business Climate Index, which kind of shows all the different business-related taxes, big and small. The only states worse than us were Minnesota, Rhode Island, Vermont, California, New York, and New Jersey. Really don't want to be ranked with California, New York, and New Jersey on anything, especially. And this was pretty evident in our growth rates and our GDP. We had a very high corporate income tax, 6.9%. This was the worst in the region. The only East Coasters that were worse than us were New York and New Jersey. So in the 2000s, overall, North Carolina fell behind the national averages and the regional growth rates. We were among the 5 states with the highest unemployment in the country for the years leading up to tax reform for the state. And now for the good news. Uh-oh. Okay. So you can find many more tax changes listed in the booklet here, but here's just some kind of highlights of actions to save taxpayer dollars since 2013. So ending the temporary sales tax, and we go into detail about this in the booklet, but in 2001, basically the General Assembly passed a temporary sales tax. So this was temporary, meaning it had a sunset date. It was supposed to expire. This was up by ½ cent. So ½ a penny sales tax, not a big deal, right? Set to expire in July of 2003. Well, in 2003, they extended it to 2005. 2005, they extended it to 2007. And then in 2007, they said, oh, actually, we're gonna give you guys a tax cut. We're going to reduce the raise of by, sorry, it was a ½ % raise, so they took ¼ cent away. So, and there was no mention of the remaining 4%. So now we're stuck with this ½ penny sales income tax rate. So in 2007 budget, they made that remaining ½ cent permanent. And unfortunately, on the personal income side, they also created a new tax bracket. So those tax brackets that were already high, they created a new 8.25% rate that was supposed to remain in 2004, but it actually stayed until 2008, 4 years after promised. So throughout those actions, lawmakers extracted $2 billion extra from taxpayers beyond the promised sunset dates. So the tax reform, all that to say that the tax reform did away with this. We ended the temporary sales tax with the tax reform for the state. So that's just the first point there. Then repealing the state estate tax. So this is an unnecessary death tax, a tax on your right to transfer your property upon death. That was eliminated in 2013, deaths after 2013. Reducing and simplifying the personal income tax. This is one that everybody can get behind. So we had that high rate of 7.75% at the top, 8.25 with the temporary increase. Currently now in 2022, we're at 4.99%, going down to 3.99 with the latest budget. So this also, of course, benefits small businesses that file on the personal income tax side. At 3.99%, we'll have the 4th lowest personal income tax in the nation, tied with Ohio after North Dakota, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. And then increasing the standard deduction. So like I said, this is the 0 income tax bracket that benefits low-income families most. This was at very, very low levels in before tax reform. It is now at, went from $6,000 in 2013 to $25,500 for married couples filing jointly, and then from $3,000 to $12,750 for single filers. So a really huge improvement there. Many more families now don't have to file personal income taxes at all. Phasing out the corporate income tax, we see this as one of the most destructive taxes to economic growth. It was 6.9% in 2013, 5% in 2014, coming gradually down. Now it's at 2.5 with the most recent budget, and it will be phased out to 0 in 2030. The corporate income tax is really detrimental to economic growth because it really is borne by the workers in terms of lower wages and fewer jobs. So at 2.5, we already have the lowest in the nation out of states that levy a corporate income tax. And we will be one of 3 states without it, South Dakota, Wyoming, and us, after we have no income tax. This is a huge benefit to workers who will end up paying for it. And we'll talk a little bit when we look at where that goes in the state budget, how it's unnecessary. Establish the state capital and infrastructure fund. So this is really common sense reform to pay as you go rather than take out debt for capital payments. So the State Capital Infrastructure Fund dedicates 4% of tax revenues, plus 1/4 of any unreserved cash balance to repairs and renovations for state facilities, which is a really big expense. We shouldn't be using debt for that type of stuff. And actually, we used to, and if we had invested in in these facilities in this way before, then we wouldn't have such a backlog of maintenance records and things that we see now since then. Holding the state sales tax at 4.75%. Of course, this is important after all those temporary sales tax increases. It's important to kind of restore some trust there. And then the local, so counties are also able to add to the state sales tax, and they do, and those are listed in the booklet as well. The highest local sales tax is 2.75%, so for a total of 7.5% sales rate. And the only two counties that have this are Durham County and Orange County. And then, of course, leadership boosted the rainy day fund, setting aside $3 billion into the reserve for the biennium. So we'll have over $4 billion, which will make us better prepared for rainy days. North Carolina was much better prepared for the economic shutdowns because of these tax reforms, which we'll get into in a little bit as well. So after all these reforms in 2013 and beyond, fiscal research and others have found that this benefits really all taxpayers, reduce the burden on everyone in some way. Okay, so what were the results? So I put some news clippings here, just screenshots from some of the attention that North Carolina got after the 2013 reforms. It's not always popular to talk about. It's more popular to talk about what we need to spend money on. But this was some of the clippings. Tom Tillis used North Carolina as an example for why tax reform works and why we should have it at the federal level during the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act with the Trump tax cuts. Which is great. So the tax reform that we went through really transformed our business climate. We have a huge tax advantage now over neighboring states. While we were improving, they were not. Looking at our neighbors, on the personal income tax side, Virginia has 5.75% and South Carolina has 7%, so much higher than ours. On the business side, we're at 2.5 going to 0. Virginia's at 6, South Carolina's at 5, and Tennessee is at 6.5. You can see that on the tax foundation map there. North Carolina is much lower than all of our neighbors there. And then robust recovery from the COVID lockdowns, of course. The most recent jobs data have shown that we are now back to pre-pandemic levels of unemployment, which is great, but our labor force has actually shrunk some, so we don't have the same exact amount of workers. That's including employed, but also unemployed, no longer looking for work. So some people have left the labor force since then, but we're back to better rates of unemployment. And of course, the recession, so there's a huge decline in economic activity because of the individual and government responses to the pandemic, which was pretty huge. Throughout the pandemic, though, North Carolina was consistently below the national average rates of unemployment. Our lowest point, so our highest point of unemployment, was at 12.9% in April. That was the lowest point for most states, while the national average was at 14%. So we did much better, and that's because of the fiscal restraint and the tax reform that came before. And then also revenue shortfalls. A lot of people say, oh, we really need this revenue. That's actually not the case. We have, after the 2013 reforms, revenue grew at a much faster rate. We can't argue that these budgets are starving or have been detrimentally affected by the tax cuts. And then, of course, adding to the rainy day fund, which we've talked about. And then migration. People are voting with their feet. We're the 9th most populated state in the nation. And over the past decade, so since all the tax reform, North Carolina has seen the 3rd highest net immigration after only Florida and Texas, which don't have individual income taxes at all. So I think there's something to say there. Yeah, and in 2020 overall, we had the 6th highest inbound migration of the 50 states, according to the Tax Foundation. And we have a new congressional seat, more representation in Congress, all those good things. Moving on to our state budget and where our money comes from and how we spend it at the state level. So how much money are we working with? There's really 2 parts to this. The General Assembly, state leadership controls the general fund, and then there's kind of everything else, right? And everything else is more than half of the total total budget available, highway and highway trust fund from the gas tax and vehicle licensing fees, things like that. But really federal dollars, and we'll get into this a little bit at the end, how those are growing. Those really consist of Medicaid, education, and transportation funding as well. So the general fund, so breaking down the general fund, so this is where our taxes go. And this is what the General Assembly has the authority to appropriate. So personal income tax revenue, more than half here. Sales and use, other taxes and non-tax revenue, such as like judicial fees, treasurer's investments, things like that. We talked about the corporate income tax and how it's detrimental to growth. It is 5% here. It has been very volatile, known to be less than 5%, and is also just detrimental to growth overall. A lot of people got upset with on the left got upset with the corporate income tax phase out, but in reality, it's a very small portion of our revenue. And then breaking down where we spend this money. So general fund expenditures, what is it spent on? Now these are really big categories, and there's a lot that you can kind of dive into, and the booklet talks a little bit more about that. But most of it is spent on education. So 60% about is spent on education. More than 14 billion of that. Sorry, that's $14 billion. Most of it is to K-12 and then UNC and then community colleges. And it's important to know that this is supplemented by the federal government as well. Same with Health and Human Services, most of which is Medicaid, also supplemented by the federal government. The second largest portion is Health and Human Services, so 23% of the budget, which the feds pay for actually about 70%. So you have $5.4 billion here. Washington sends about $12 billion more to our Medicaid program. And then we have debt service. So our debt service has actually decreased and is back to 2015 levels, the amount that we're paying for our debt each year. And then other expenditures include general government functioning, agriculture, natural resources, and then the grant program. Moving on to our state debt and unfunded liabilities. So debt can be measured in very different ways, and some debt measurements include federal government, promised pensions, unemployment trust loans, things like this. This data comes from the Office of the State Controller. The most recent, very recent data from the end of the fiscal year in 2021 shows that we're around $8 billion of debt, so it's about $800 per person. And this is outstanding debt from bonds and direct borrowing. In 2004, the General Assembly created the Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, which says how much we can afford to our debt capacity for the next 10 years. And they're keeping an eye on that one. And then the net tax-supported debt service, we're supposed to be giving $100 million to the Solvency Fund each year to pay this down. And it should be targeted at no more than 4%. And the advice is that we should not, no less than 50% of our debt should be retired over the next 10 years. So remember that I said our debt is about $8 billion. Much bigger and murkier than that is our unfunded liability situation. So this is very critical for our fiscal future, and it's not just a state issue. Local governments also and city governments have unfunded liabilities because of the state employees and the promises that have been made. So just a little bit of information here. So we have very high ratings in terms of debt and unfunded liabilities, but it's still a huge problem. And this is money that has been promised to retirees in the form of pensions or in forms of health benefits. So very important, but also important to be honest about and transparent. So we have this in a manageable sense. So state retirees have a defined benefit pension plan, meaning that they're promised a certain level of benefits from when they become eligible to when they pass away. And one of the problems is that we have a very low eligibility criteria. So compared to other states, we have people only have to serve 5 years before they can have benefits for life. And so that's a great thing if you're being employed, but it also creates a huge burden on taxpayers in the long run. Keep in mind that our biggest employer in the state, in North Carolina, is the state government. And a lot of that is going to higher ed. We have almost $40 billion total if you add up pensions and healthcare benefits, and these are ballooning. So annual taxpayer-funded contributions are now at $2 billion, and this is up a significant amount from 2011. So what are the risks here? So there's a couple of risks, but of course it can hurt the government's ability to provide services. So these essential services that we need can be kind of closed out by this ballooning responsibility here. Also, government employees may receive less than expected. So if they come on, they're promised something, they may receive less than their expected compensation, which is obviously not ideal. And then finally, the taxpayers may be asked to pay more for this service to state employees. So like I said, tightening the eligibility criteria would help this because we have a very generous eligibility criteria with only 5 years of service. And then in 2017, the General Assembly actually took action on this and closed, and this is not necessarily the ideal solution, but they closed the Retiree Health Benefits Fund so that no more members hired on would receive benefits after January 1st, 2021. So they would not be eligible for medical benefits after they retire. During service, they would still have those benefits. So those are just some of the things they've done to address and some of the big numbers there. And actually, depending on how the assumptions are made on the rate of returns for these, this is with the Treasurer's Office, the unfunded liabilities may actually be much larger. And so one of the things that Locke has recommended is that having a more realistic number about the rate of returns on pensions would show a higher liability. We calculated to be about 30 billion as opposed to the 27 billion here. So that's a big number. As far as I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about COVID. So there has been a lot of money, as we talked about, from the federal government coming into the state, and some of that has been to address COVID. So in 2020, we had a significant amount from the CARES Act. In 2021, from ARPA, and of course we were at different situations. Early in the pandemic, we didn't have the vaccine. There was a lot of different issues going on to address, but the money is continuing to pour in. Hindsight's 2020, but this has been a huge economic test for states, for local governments, for education, for anyone who's trying to spend this money, and it has really added to inflation, which has now become a huge problem. And we're going to see this analyzed, for years to come, how the government dealt with this, how individuals dealt with this, and from a financial perspective, especially. The federal COVID funds actually increased 384% in 2021, and this is primarily due because a lot of the CARES money was unspent, and we're still working with a lot of unspent money from the American Rescue Plan Act. So this number is just going to states, but there's also significantly more money going straight to educators and straight to cities and local governments who are struggling to spend this money. The biggest issue here is that the money is not targeted. Heritage found that 9% of the American Rescue Plan was actually sent to on healthcare, on actual public health, and of course, not having targeted relief is wasteful and really inflationary. So part of the reason that the last state budget that was passed in November got a lot of, had checked the boxes for a lot of people is because we had so much extra money, and the ARPA funds were able to fund a lot of great initiatives, but there was a lot of rules on that. We can't use it to offset tax cuts, can't use it to add to savings, but you can use it to offset government revenue, government employees, all that type of stuff, which can add to further problems in the back end. So all that to say, I don't know why it's clicking forward. All that to say that we have a spending issue, and these federal funds have not necessarily helped. and state spending overall is still on the rise. So we have seen restraint. We talked a lot about the restraint in the first part of the presentation, but state spending is still on the rise. There has been restraint in the last decade, but long term there has been tremendous growth, and you can see we have some helpful graphs in the booklet on that overall. And so many folks on the left continue to say that we're shortchanging the budget, that we have a starving budget, that we need more money, and it's not the answer. I'm going to paraphrase a Thomas Sowell quote where he said, the government could spend itself into bankruptcy, and Keynesians would still say that if we had more money, we could fix the problem. So that's certainly, COVID has been a good example of that, how the money has not helped. It's not necessarily fixed the problem. We have a lack of targeted aid. And unfortunately, some politicians have been capitalizing on this to get their political wish lists. So just thinking about, how are we spending the money that we have, and are we spending it wisely? The reality is that our state faces lots of issues, and throwing money at them is not going to solve them, as we can see with our record high inflation. And to close, I'll just say something that one of my former mentors would say all the time, that politics and policy is downstream from culture. And in our culture, we have a culture, as all of you know, of kind of growing entitlement, and infecting young people and politicians and everyone across the board. People wanting to be more like Europe or more like Canada, more essential services, and it's not the answer. And we're very lucky to have a state that understands fiscal responsibility and that has been such a leader. But it's important to remember. So I'll close with that. Money is always best in the hands of the folks who work it and who work for it. Sorry, and we can never be too wary of a growing government. With that, I will conclude my presentation, and I will stand by for any questions. Thanks so much.